Okay, this is Whitney Russell discussing Module 1, questioning the curriculum. So before I jump into the questions that were posed to us, I just wanted to give a quick overview of what's going to be covered in this screencast. First, I'm going to talk about the history of curriculum development and how it has changed in my lifetime. Then I'm going to jump into a definition of what curriculum is, as well as who decides what is and is not included in that curriculum. Then there will be a bit of a reflection where I discuss the purpose of schools and teachers. And then last will be a wrap up, kind of tying it all together. So to begin, what is the history of curriculum development and how has it changed in my lifetime? To understand that, we have to go really far back in history and talk about what education looked like back in the 1700s. Now, remember, this was before really formal education. And so young people were trained and educated through apprenticeships. A couple of examples of that would be blacksmithing or textile production. Then in the 1800s, you see more and more students entering universities and, well, before universities, going to high school and entering universities. And the focus there is, like a lot of traditional universities, the focus was on the classics and learning the Latin and Greek curricula. The problem with this is that by the turn of the century, in the 1900s, 85% of the population were not college bound. So they're learning things that have nothing to do with their life. And so many of them dropped out. They did not need the classics in their field of work, and so they didn't finish high school. Another problem with this was that it was focused really on memorization and recitation. There wasn't that deeper problem-solving skills. So in the early 1900s, we see a shift of education to address the needs of the majority of students. 90% of them were dropping out. And so what did those 90% need? Well, most of them were going into vocations after high school. And so you see the birth of vocational education. It was very progressive in the sense that it was concerned about the learner and not so much about the content. This is also when we see psychologists come forward with a lot of educational theory talking about the learner and his or her place in society and what their responsibilities are towards the democracy that they lived in, really based on the works of John Dewey. Then in post-World War II, we see another major shift of the focus of curriculum development. It's kind of a back to basics movement. This was, remember, during the time of our competitions, if you will, the space race with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union launches Sputnik and America panics and thinks, oh, we need to focus on math and science so that we can beat them. And then you get to the 1960s and 1970s, and people are like, hold on, we don't like this militaristic top-down approach of education. We want education to be focused more on the individual. So you see this pendulum swing. In the 1930s, it's focused on the individual, and then post-World War II, it's focused on the state, and then in the 1960s and 70s, it goes back to being focused on the individual. It was a personalized, more humanistic approach rather than that science, math. Then in the 1980s, a really influential report is published called A Nation at Risk, in which it says that the United States is failing. And this is coincides with kind of a general economic downturn in the US, where we weren't as competitive in the global market as we had been before. And so there is a shift back, the pendulum swifts back to a focus on the core subject so that we can be competitive with other nations. This is when you really start to see educational assessment. You start to see school and teacher accountability. You start to see testing, standardized testing across the board. And these things, this idea of educational assessment and school and teacher accountability, are carried over into today. And this was a product of the 1980s, and we still see it in place today. So how has the focus of curriculum changed in my lifetime? I was born in the 1980s during that a nation at risk time. And so education has really been, it seems, focused on standardization, performance, accountability. When I was in high school, the No Child Left Behind Act was passed, and I remember my teachers panicking because there were penalties if you weren't performing at the level that you were supposed to be performing at. And then in more recent years, you see the passage of Every Student Succeeds, which again still has the standardization that we've seen in previous decades and previous generations, but it's not as punitive as No Child Left Behind. But in my opinion, I see kind of a mix of this humanistic approach, but also this top-down idea of we need to reach standardized benchmarks. So I kind of have seen all of it in my lifetime, both as a student and now as a teacher. So section 2, let's talk a little bit about curriculum in general. What is it and who decides what is or is not included? So the definition of curriculum, according to Franklin Bobbitt, who was a very important educational philosopher of his time, he divided curriculum into two parts. He said first that it is the entire range of experience, both undirected and directed, concerned in unfolding the abilities of the individual. So basically it's the things that are taught and the things that are learned, right? Directed and undirected. And it's focused on students being able to find their abilities. And then the second part of that definition is it is the series of consciously directed training experiences, i.e., what teachers deliver, that the schools use for completing the perfecting of the unfoldment, meaning the unfolding of abilities. So to kind of put that in a more simple term, and that's really the focus. Part 2 is kind of the focus of what curriculum is today, is how do we as teachers help our students reach their abilities, essentially, is what curriculum is. So how do these consciously directed training experiences help students unfold their abilities? And it has also been recently broadened to include investigations into a hidden curriculum, meaning like unconscious things that are geared toward things such as race and gender inequality. Is there a hidden curriculum that produces these instances of stratification in education? So then who decides what is or isn't included in the curriculum? And again, I'm going to kind of go back in time and investigate this question historically. And first I'm going to look at the elementary school standpoint of who decides what is or is not included in curriculum. So prior to 1910, who decided this was the state. The state produced or gave out a sequential list of subjects that needed to be taught. You need to teach English, science, history, math, and it was sequential, so it needed to be taught in a certain order. So these subjects taught in a certain order, and it was divided into two areas. First being skills, and second being content. And the belief was that students needed to master skills before they could conquer the content. And subject lists were consistent from state to state. Like you would get the same subject list in California that you would in, say, Illinois. The only difference was maybe there were some state-based like history or geography subjects that needed to be taught, but for the most part, it was consistent from state to state. Then from 1910 to 1930, subject matters were still determined by the state and remained relatively unchanged, but the new curriculum changed drastically, how these subjects were delivered. So the subjects stayed the same, but how the curriculum was delivered changed drastically. And this was in response to new ideas from educational psychologists like John Dewey and Edward Thorndike. And they believed that the curriculum should be more in line with student interests and abilities rather than, this state-mandated curriculum. So these curricular modifications happened locally. And again, they didn't change the state mandated list, they just changed how it was delivered. But these dynamic ideas started to kind of wane over time as we get further on. Now let's talk about high school. Who determines what curriculum is delivered to high school students? What is and what is not included in the curriculum? So prior to 1930, high school students were taught what was taught in the colleges. So whatever was taught at the college level, high school teachers believe that's what should be taught at whatever was taught at the college level, they believe should be taught at the high school level. So that is what was taught to high school students. And then on the other side of that, you had vocational education, which was determined by the state boards of vocational education. And those were kind of two tracks. Students would either be college bound and they would take those college prep classes, or they would be work bound and they would take these vocational type classes, which again were determined by state boards of education. Then in the Depression era, we saw that less students were dropping out of school because there was 100% unemployment in the sector that youth were usually employed in. And so because there were no jobs, they stayed in school longer. So the curriculum was totally overhauled by different commissions that kind of met together and asked, what do our students need? And so these commissions at this point in time during the Depression era were the ones who determined what curriculum was included and what curriculum wasn't. There was an emphasis on the abilities, interests, and needs of high school students. Then in post-World War II, you see a lot more federal involvement in education at this point. Again, this was in reaction to the success of the Soviet Union space program. And so the federal government starts handing out money to states. And though that was under the National Defense Education Act, as well as the National Science Foundation. And this curriculum development was determined by scientists and mathematicians in the field. They came together and said, what do students need to know? So again, it was federally funded, but determined by professionals in the field. Then today, content is still determined by the state. It basically always has been determined by the state. You just see more or less federal involvement and more or less private involvement in education. But the curriculum is varied and complex. You see all different types of curriculum. So while the content standards are determined by the state, how that content is delivered is really variable. And it's oftentimes up to the school or up to the teacher. So in my reflection, I want to talk a little bit about what the purpose of schools and teachers are. And there's been a lot of discussion on that. If you were to look at this infographic or flowchart, whatever it is that you want to call it, looking at kind of the attitude towards education over time. So in 1934, you have a quote from John Dewey, and I'm going to jump ahead to this next slide that kind of pulls out some important quotes. So in 1930s, John Dewey says that the purpose of education has always been to give the young the things that they need in order to develop in an orderly, sequential way into members of society. So John Dewey was very much concerned of how do we make these young people functioning members of society. So he was always kind of concerned with the greater good, for lack of a better term. And then you have a quote from the 1950s from Martin Luther King, and he says, intelligence plus character. That's the purpose of education. And I really liked that one. And then a more recent one from the 1990s says the one contributing purpose of education has been to bring people to a full realization as possible of what it is to be a human being. So these are all different ideas of what the purpose of education is. But to me, I want to talk a little bit about my purpose in education. And I kind of agree with everything that was said by these, incredibly important figures in education, that it is about teaching students to be the best members of society that they can be. It is about teaching them to be smart, but also to have character. And it is about teaching them what it means to be human. But for me, my purpose in teaching is to help students find worth. And I hope that doesn't sound naive, but to me, all the content in the world isn't important. It is important. It's what I teach. But at the end of the day, as long as when they look back at their time in my classroom and feel that they were worth something, that they had an impact, that's my purpose, is to make all of my students feel worthy and accepted and to really form a relationship with them. So in conclusion, a wrap up if you will. It's been a very interesting process to kind of look at the history of education. But one thing that I took away from it is this idea of pendulum swinging. If you look through the history of education, it kind of goes back and forth from, this humanistic approach to a focus on core, to a humanistic approach to a focus on core. And right now we're a little bit focused on, teacher accountability and standardized testing. But I kind of would like to throw out there that the pendulum always shifts. That's what a pendulum does. And it will be interesting through my career to kind of note how the focus of curriculum changes and shifts as time goes on. So thanks.